Hello everyone, this is Demographia. Now, before we actually get into the video, I just want to make a bit of a caveat here to explain what this video will be like, because it is basically unlike any video I've made on this channel, or really any video I've made on any of my other channels. So what I'd like to say is that this video is going to be very heavily statistic based, which means that it might become somewhat boring or repetitive. So there will be a bunch of timestamps in this video, and this video will be broken down into several parts. I will talk about what would each continent's population be, what would each region of Europe and Asia's population be, what percentage of the global diaspora would come from each country, which countries would receive the most people, going literally country by country, so you can scroll to find your own country. And then I will look at which countries have large diasporas, again going country by country, so you can skip to whatever country interests you. And then which countries would have the most per capita growth, again you can go to whichever country interests you specifically. But yeah, I just wanted to point that out, that don't feel obligated to watch the entire thing if you don't find it all that interesting. Maybe you're not that interested in the Yemeni diaspora, but you are in the Norwegian diaspora. Hello everyone, this is Demographia, and welcome to today's video about what if everyone returned to their original homeland. Now, before I get started, I just want to say that this video is actually part of a collaboration. Who is it with? Mike History. Now you might say, wait a second, isn't that you? Yes, that's right, that is me. I am collaborating with myself on this, but my history part of this collaboration is all about what if colonialism never happened, and it actually inspired this video because I realized, well, I haven't looked at what the demographic effects of that would be, and since I already have a channel about demographics, why not do it here? And so welcome to my longest and most ambitious ever single video. Now, my clothing project was a lot longer and harder to do, both in terms of research and scope, but that was a series of videos which I put in live streams. This one's going to be one video, I hope. So let's get to it. Now, have you ever wondered what the world would look like if everyone returned to their ancestral homeland? How different would the world be like today? Well, this is the question that this video will try to answer. But this is super broad and complex, and before we can continue, what counts as someone's original homeland needs to be defined. If we want to be super technical, you could keep pushing this back until we get to East Africa, or wherever you believe humans originated from. But that would make the whole video boring and redundant. Therefore, we will first have to define what is someone's native or ancestral homeland, and then explain how this works. So as mentioned earlier, everywhere where a group lives now once belonged to someone else or was originally uninhabited. So we have to establish some boundaries on how we're going to define original homelands. Generally, if a population lived in a region 600 years ago or earlier, they will be considered native to the land. Now that might seem like a kind of random arbitrary date, but this basically allows for the world to look like what it did before the mass migrations caused by colonialism. And after all, this is a companion video to Micah History's video on what if colonialism never occurred. However, this rule isn't necessarily ironclad. If an entire group changed locations within that 600-year time period, we will not force them to go back. I will give an example. To many people's surprises, the Zulus are not actually native to South Africa and actually reached the land after the Europeans did. However, since there is no Zulu homeland back where they originally came from, we will have the Zulus just stay where they currently are. However, this will not apply to groups where the entire population did move. So, for example, if we take the English, they originally came from Germany and Denmark. But since there are no English left there and the English identity formed in England, they will be considered native to England, even though, of course, they do have ancestry from somewhere else. However, since the English didn't all move out of England during colonial times, the English diaspora in this video will be returning to England. Hopefully, this helps clear up some confusion on how I measure how so-called native a group is. But one important caveat to make here is that a group that is a minority in a certain country is not automatically considered as foreign. Many ethnic minorities belong to a group that is a majority in the neighboring country and might not be recent migrants. A good example of this are Italians in Switzerland, who have been there for over 1,000 years, and thus we would not send Swiss Italians back to Italy. Generally, most groups that fall under this category of being minorities, because borders don't exactly match with ethnic boundaries, are not considered foreigners, but this isn't always the case. For example, Russia borders Estonia, but I don't consider the Russians in Estonia as native because they pretty much all moved very recently. Now, one very important thing to note is that when I'm measuring the population gain and losses in a region, there could be a significant overlap. For example, many migrants in Europe come from other parts of Europe. But because I did this project country by country, the number of people leaving Europe is just a sum of all the people who left from each European country, and not necessarily everyone who left from Europe as a whole. However, this flaw will be fixed because the number of inbound migrants is also done on a country basis, meaning the loss of, for example, 1 million Polish immigrants in the UK will show back up as a gain of 1 million immigrants in Poland, and thus increase the total number of immigrants to Europe, even if they're coming from somewhere else within Europe. Now, finally, one super important thing to mention is what to do with mixed people. Now, as a mixed person myself, this is particularly prescient since I had to decide how to determine to which country a mixed person would return. Generally, most mixed people are a mix of two ancestries, and thus I would take the entire population of that group and send one half to one place and one half to the other place of origin. This does not work perfectly because people aren't always exactly half and half, and some places have very mixed origins, like Brazil or South Africa, in which I had to send people back based on generally what percentage of ancestry came from each original homeland. For example, the Brazilian Pardos are roughly 70% Portuguese, and thus 70% of the Pardo population in Brazil would be sent to Portugal in this scenario. Now, this becomes especially relevant when calculating the size of a diaspora, because there are three ways to measure it. You can only look at the number of so-called pure descendants, the number of those plus half the mixed population, or people with any ancestry there, which includes both full and mixed people. Therefore, instead of choosing one, I've made several charts showing the numbers based on each category. Now, as you can tell from all this, there is no perfect system, but hopefully you understand the general rules I'm using here to determine who is a native, and that's how I got the numbers for the diaspora for each group or country. Now, with all of that context out of the way, let's finally begin the video. So, obviously, if everyone returned to their homeland, the world would look so different today that it would be unrecognizable. Nevertheless, it is clear that some places would look much more different than others, with Asia being the least affected continent, while the Americas would be the most affected, and Europe, Africa, and Oceania would be somewhere in between. Let's start with the areas that would gain the most population. Now, if everyone did return to their homeland, Europe would be by far the biggest winner, no matter what metrics we use. Even if we restrict migration to only those of full or overwhelmingly majority European descent, then Europe's population would increase by over 500 million, or in other words, it would grow by 55%. And this is even with 108 million people in Europe moving out of the country they currently live in. Though not all these immigrants would leave Europe, a lot of them would just go to other countries within Europe. If we then include half of all the descendants of mixed European ancestry, with most coming from Latin America, then Europe's population would increase by a further 157 million to reach 672 million immigrants, or an increase of 76%. And if we want to be really ambitious and we include all of those of mixed European descent, then an astonishing 830 million people would land on Europe's shores, leading the population to basically double. Therefore, the total number of Europeans is roughly 1,147 million. But if you take half of mixed Europeans, then that number goes up by 157 million to just over 1.3 billion. And if you consider everyone of European descent as European, then the number of Europeans surges to 1,461 million. In other words, almost 1.5 billion. Now, after Europe, you might believe that the biggest beneficiary of this mass wave of migration would be Asia. And while it is true in numbers, it wouldn't be as drastic as you think in terms of percentage, because of how insanely high Asia's population already is. With almost 4.7 billion Asians in the world, any amount of migration would affect the overall population little. And with 114 million people leaving the country in Asia they currently live in, this would be the case even more. But even with literally 200 million people coming in to replace them, Asia's population growth wouldn't even change by 2%. And depending on whether you only include full or mixed Asians, the population of the continent would only change by between 1.76 and 1.83%. This means that Asia's population would increase from nearly 4.7 to nearly 4.8 billion people. So understanding this, on a per capita basis, Africa would grow the most after Europe if all of its diaspora came home. If we only include those of full or overwhelming African descent, then its population would increase by around 133 million, or about 7%. If we then add half of those of mixed African descent, mostly from Brazil and the Caribbean, then that number goes up to around 156 million, or 9%. And if we include all those of African descent, then the continent's population would increase by nearly 180 million people, or around 11%. Now, due to how little migration exists within Africa, both from within and without the continent, the loss would only amount to around 26 million people. This would leave Africa's population at exactly 1.5 billion if only full Africans are included, and at around 1,550 million if all of those of African descent are included. But with the old world explained, it's now time to get to the new world in Oceania, which would suffer enormous population losses. Oceania is by far the smallest continent in both size and population, with a modest population of just around 45 million people. However, as you can already guess, most of that population is made up of Europeans in its two largest countries, Australia and New Zealand. And with those people going back to their homelands, alongside the Asian minority as well, the population of Oceania would decrease by a drastic 70%, and 31 million people leaving and only 13 million left in the entire continent. The growth of around 350,000 new people would be so negligible that it would be all but irrelevant. And now we get to the big boys in the Americas. The Americas are the most demographically interesting and important continents in this video because they are so diverse and have such a variety of peoples, many of whom are mixed, that all the numbers here will change drastically depending on which metrics are used. Even including all people of significant or partial Native American ancestry, South America's population would decrease by an astonishing 281 million, or nearly 65%. If we only let half of the mixed native population remain, then that number increases to a loss of 342 million, or 78% leaving. And finally, if only the native South Americans remain, then the continent would deal with a loss of just over 400 million people, out of a pre-migration population of 434 million, leaving less than 31 million people left. This would be a decrease of almost 93%. Even with all those of significant native ancestry left, the population would still be just around 153 million people. And finally, North America would be hit the hardest, to nobody's surprise. Now, it's at this time that I should inform you that I will not be including Mexico here unless I specify. That seems kind of random, especially because Mexico is the 10th most populated country on the planet. But Mexico was the only country in the world where I could find no good estimates on race. Trying to find the amount of European Mexicans, for example, got me anything from 10 to 50% of the population, which was way too variable to be useful. Therefore, using genetics, I calculated that if you took all Mexicans, then their average ancestry would be around 40% European. But the reason I still kept this separate is because it doesn't mean that 40% of Mexicans are European, since the majority of the population is of mixed European and native descents. And hence there's not a clear-cut 60% non-European population. With that caveat explained, even with all those of partial significant native North American ancestry remaining, the population would go down by around 384 million, or an 87% loss. If half the mixed population remained, then that number would increase to 411 million, or about 91% leaving. And if only fully or predominantly native North Americans remained, then almost 440 million out of 592 million North Americans would leave. Again, this does not include Mexico, so taking them out, that means that 440 out of 462 million people would be leaving, or a population crash of 96%. If we refer to our earlier genetic breakdown of Mexico, then almost 55 million Mexicans would leave as well, although this number is faulty for the reasons I already explained. Now, with this overview of continents, it is time to delve into the specific regions of Europe and Asia. This is because half of the continents would be losing population, and the vast majority of the migrants to Africa would be descendants of slaves, whose ancestry from specific countries is unknown. We'll start with Asia, whose distribution of immigrants would be very uneven. As context, we're dividing Asia into 5 regions, which also correspond closely with the 5 main cultural and racial regions of this enormous continent. Southeast Asia would see the smallest change, losing about 26 million people, most of which would go to China, but gaining 18 million people, most of which are the Filipino diaspora. Thus, Southeast Asia's population would go from about 675 to 667 million people, or a loss of 1.22%. Moving on to Central Asia, the migration numbers would be much smaller, with a loss of 3 million, mostly to Russia, but a gain of 1.3 million, causing the population to go from 81.7 to 80 million, or a decline of 2.1%. West Asia would see a much larger change in population, not necessarily in percentage, but in terms of numbers. There would be 55 million people leaving their countries, but this would be offset by an influx of 67 million. This would cause the region's population to grow from 313 to 325 million, or an increase of 3.85%. But now we get to the 2 big juggernauts, East and South Asia, which are dominated by the giant countries of China and India. Because almost no one moves to South Asia, it would only lose around 1 million people, while gaining 41 million more. However, given the region's pre-migration population of around 1,934 million, this would only increase it by 2.1%. And finally, we have East Asia, which would have a loss of around 28 million people, though this number is deceptive since it would mostly just be Chinese people leaving Taiwan and return to China, hence explain part of the 68 million fully East Asian immigrant number. With the addition of all those of some significant East Asian ancestry, then you'd get 71 million people arriving. Again though, East Asia's population is so enormous that this barely makes a dent, with an increase of 2.46% if only including fully East Asian immigrants, to just 2.64% if we include them plus mixed East Asians. And so now we move to Europe, the smallest but most important continent being analyzed here. Europe will be divided into 3 regions that are pretty familiar to us. The first region is North Europe, which includes Germanic Europe plus the culturally similar states of Ireland and Finland. The second region is Eastern Europe, which includes all former European communist countries, as well as Greece and Cyprus, but minus Romania and Moldova. Those 2 are accepted because they belong to the category of Romance Europe, which is fairly self-explanatory. However, you will notice I cut off 2 Romance countries from this category, which are Portugal and Spain. As you'll see, their diaspora is so huge that they needed a separate category. Now, Eastern Europe would be the region that changed the least, but that is only in comparison to other populations, since its population would still change drastically. Around 12 million people would move out of their countries, though they would mostly move between Eastern European states, but there would be an increase of 65 million, causing the population of Eastern Europe to grow from 298 to 352 million, or an increase of nearly 18%. Romance Europe would experience a population loss of around 32 million people, but this would be massively offset by an increase of around 124 million full Romance Europeans. This number would be increased to around 126 million if we include those of mixed descent. Romance Europe's population would grow from 161 to around 254 million, or 57% if we only include fully Romance Europeans. If we include those who are mixed, then the population would increase by 1 million, and the percentage in population increase would also increase by 1. Meanwhile, Northern Europe would see a loss of 56 million people, but this would be vastly outnumbered by the incoming flow of 216 million fully Northern European immigrants. If half of the mixed population was included, then that number would grow to 219 million, and if all of them were included, it would jump to 222 million Northern Europeans coming back. Northern Europe's population would grow from 219 million to 378 million, if only including fully Northern European immigrants, or an increase of 72%. This would increase to 382 million if including half the mixed population, and 385 million if we include all mixed people, or an increase of 75%. And finally, last but not least, we would see the demographics of Iberia specifically change drastically, more than anywhere else in the entire Old World. Now, as you can already guess, almost the entirety of Latin America would be moving there, precipitating huge changes to the population to the peninsula with a population of 59 million. While it would lose around 7 million people, it would gain 109 million fully Iberian immigrants to replace them. If that sounds like a lot, just half of the mixed Iberian population would outnumber this entire group, with 153 million, meaning that if you combine those two groups, which are fully and half of the mixed ones, then you get 262 million people coming in. And if you include all of the mixed people, then the number surges to 415 million. Now, if that wasn't insane enough, remember that these calculations still don't include Mexico, which would contribute 54 million according to the calculation that I explained earlier in the video. So if only full or predominantly Iberian immigrants arrived, the population would increase to 161 million, or a growth of 171%. If half the mixed population was added to this, then the population would increase to 316 million, or a growth of 432%. And if both the mixed and fully Iberian populations were combined, it would reach 467 million, or a growth rate of 687%. This really shows you why so many people left the peninsula, because you can only imagine how crowded it would be today if they had all stayed. And once again, that last number still wasn't including Mexico. If we take the diasporas around the world, what percentage from each region and country contributes to the total number? We'll start off only by looking at the unmixed diaspora, so those who are of full descent from a certain country. In this case, unsurprisingly, Europe comes up on top, with nearly 60% of the global diaspora originating from Europe. Asia would come next with a quarter of the world's population, and Africa would be third with 15%. Specifically in Asia, 8.13% would come from East Asia, 7.07% would come from West Asia, and 4.67% would come from South Asia, with the remaining 5.4% coming from Central and Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, in Europe, 25.36% would come from Northern Europe, 14.67% would come from Romance Europe, 12.93% would come from Iberia, and 6.59% would come from Eastern Europe. Now, when looking at both full and half of the mixed diaspora, which from now on I will be referring to as the so-called combined diaspora, then things change quite a lot. The European diaspora jumps to 64.5%, the Asian diaspora decreases to a fifth of the world, and the African diaspora slightly decreases to 14.66%. Specifically in Asia, 6.73% would come from East Asia, 5.85% would come from West Asia, and 3.88% would come from South Asia, with the remaining 4.4% coming from Central and Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, in Europe, 25% would now come from Iberia instead of Northern Europe, which would now contribute 21.13%. 12.21% would come from Romance Europe, and 5.47% would come from East. Finally, we get to the partial diaspora, which includes all those of any partial significant ancestry from anywhere in the world. However, the following statistics are problematic because since mixed people have ancestry from usually two regions, this means that there will be an overlap in numbers. So keep that in mind when I present the following statistics. The European percentage of the diaspora would now be 2/3 of the world, with Asia contributing around 18% and Africa 14%. However, as you might expect, Iberia's percentage here would surge to over 1/3 of the global diaspora, at nearly 35%, and Northern Europe would be almost half, at around 18%, the same as all of Asia. Meanwhile, Romance Europe would be at around 10.5%, and Eastern Europe would be just 4.2%. As for Asia, East Asia would make up around 5.5%, West Asia would be around 4%, and South Asia would be around 3.3%. Now let's focus on which individual countries have the largest diaspora and thus would receive the most people coming back home, starting with those of unmixed origin. We'll start off with Lebanon, which would be receiving just over 5 million people, or 0.59% of the total global diaspora. Next would be Pakistan with 0.6%, Turkey with around 6,582,000, or 7.78%. Then there would be the Netherlands with 7,547,000, or 0.89%. And Israel with 9,845,000, or 1.16%. Now, crossing from the realm of 7 to 8 digits, there would be the Philippines with just over 10 million, or 1.19%, Syria with 10,412,000, or 1.23%. Ukraine would receive 11,327,000, a much-needed boost in its draining war with Russia, which to Ukraine's chagrin would actually receive 16,438,000 or 1.94% of the global diaspora. Up next would be Portugal, receiving 17,365,000 or 2.05%, and Poland, which would receive 19,538,000 or around 2.31%. Crossing the 20 million mark first would be Ireland, receiving almost 22 million people on its tiny territory, or 2.59% of the global diaspora. After Ireland would be India, which would receive a surprisingly small amount of just over 26 million, or 3.1% of the global diaspora. Finally, there would be France, which would receive 28,828,000, or 3.41% of the global diaspora. Now, despite this, only 5 countries make up half of the global unmixed diaspora, with the first being Germany, which would receive 62,796,000 or 7.42% of it. The second being China, just beating them with 63,253,000 or 7.47%. The next duo are the Mediterranean brothers of Italy and Spain, with Italy receiving 91,771,000 or 10.84%, and Spain receiving 92,038,000 or 10.88%. And so what is the country with the largest unmixed diaspora? Well, that honor goes to the United Kingdom, which would be the only country whose population would be increasing by over 100 million people, specifically 114 million people, or 13.5% of the world diaspora. But beating the UK in general is the African slave diaspora in the Americas, and while it's obvious that it's not a country, it would just beat out the UK with 117 million, or 13.87% of the global diaspora. If we take everyone with any significant ancestry from any of these individual countries, then the chart changes significantly. But again, we must remember that there's overlap with mixed people having different ancestries, so this shouldn't be seen as clear-cut categories. Nevertheless, I will share my results here. With many countries not having significant mixed descendants, a lot of the results would be the same. But the percentages would be different, with Lebanon and Pakistan having 0.42%, Turkey having 0.55%, Israel having 0.82%, and the Philippines having 0.84%. However, with the inclusion of many colored South Africans, the Dutch diaspora would go to 10,348,000 or 0.86%. Syria would have 0.87%, Ukraine 0.92%, Russia 1.37%, Poland 1.63%, and Ireland with 1.83%. Now, with about 336,000 mixed descendants, India's diaspora population would slightly increase and would comprise 2.2%. France's population would go up by more, with around 1.5 million people of mixed French descent, in addition to the 28.8 million fully French people, thus making up 2.53% of the diaspora. Germany's diaspora would be 5.23%, while China's population would go up by a little more, with 3 million people of mixed Chinese descent, leading to its diaspora making up 5.52% of the diaspora. Italy would make up 7.64% of the diaspora, but the United Kingdom would come up next despite a boost of around 424,000 mixed people, leading to a 9.57% share of the global diaspora. Now, the reason the UK doesn't win this time is because the Iberian diaspora is massive if you include all those of Iberian descent, because this includes almost the entire population of Latin America. While there are only 17 million people of full Portuguese descent, there are an astounding 142 million people of mixed Portuguese descent, almost all in Brazil. This makes a combined total of 159.3 million people, or 13.27% of the global diaspora, making Portugal the country with the largest diaspora on a per capita basis. And of course, Spain is number one with an additional 164 million people in addition to the 92 million unmixed, leading to a combined population of 256.5 million people, or 21.37%. Now, if we move on to the combined diaspora, which means those of full origin and the mixed population with origins from that country divided by the percentage of that mix from that country, which is usually half, then this means that Lebanon and Pakistan would be 0.49% of the diaspora and Turkey would make up 0.64%. The Netherlands' mixed population would be 1.4 million, leading their overall diaspora to be 8,948,000 or 0.87% of the diaspora. Israel would make up 0.96 and the Philippines would make up 0.99. Syria would make up 1.02, Ukraine would make up 1.11, Russia would make up 1.61, Poland would make up 1.91, and Ireland would make up 2.14% of the global diaspora. India, in this case, would receive 168,000 mixed people, leading them to make up 2.57% of the diaspora, and France would receive 771,000 mixed people, leading them to make up 2.89% of the diaspora. Germany would make up 6.14% of the diaspora, while China would slightly beat them out, at 6.18% due to having an influx of about 1.5 million mixed people. Up next would be Portugal, whose full-blooded diaspora would be 17,365,000. But this would be dwarfed by even just half of the mixed population, which would add up to 71 million people, leading to a combined diaspora of 88,332,000, or 8.63%. Italy would just slip ahead with 8.97%, while the UK would receive 11.21% of the diaspora. The winner would once again be Spain, though, with 92 million of full descent and 82 million, or half, of the mixed population, leading to a total diaspora of 174 million, or 17% of the diaspora. This would even beat the African slave-descended diaspora, which would have 117 million people of full descent and 20 million people of half African descent, combining to a total of 137 million, or 13.58%. This data is the best because it incorporates both full and partial descendants of people from different countries, without having the mixed origins of people overlap. That was a lot of information. But with all these members of the diaspora coming home, from which countries would they be coming from? Let's begin with Hungary. Hungary would receive around 1.7 million people, of which 90,000, or 5.3%, would come from Austria, 100,000, or 5.88%, would come from Ukraine, and 172,000, or 10.12%, would come from Canada. But the overwhelming majority of the Hungarian diaspora would be returning from the United States, comprising 78.68%, or 1,339,000. Morocco would receive 3,760,000 in its diaspora, all from Europe. 412,000 would come from Italy, representing 11%. 432,000 would come from the Netherlands, representing 11.49%. 435,000 would come from Belgium, representing 11.57%. 975,000 would come from Spain, representing 26%, and 1.5 million Moroccans, or 40%, would come from France. Now, the Scandinavian diaspora is very interesting because the pattern for each country is basically identical. Denmark would receive 1,410,000 people, with 22,000 coming from Norway, or 1.57%, 42,000 coming from Sweden, or 3%, and 102,000 coming from Canada, or 7.26%. But the vast majority will come from the US, or 1.239,000, or 1,239,000 people, comprising 87.89%. Norway would receive 4,286,000, of which 42,000, or 1%, would come from Sweden, 315,000, or 7.37%, would come from Canada, and 3,918,000, or 91.42% of Norwegians would come from the United States. Finally, there's Sweden, which would receive 3,566,000, of which 38,000, or 1.09%, would come from Norway. 172,000, or 4.83%, would come from Canada, and 3,349,000, or 92.91%, would come from the US. Next, going to Bulgaria, 1,690,000 would be going back, with 41,000 coming from Greece, or 2.46%, 45,000 coming from Moldova, or 2.7%, 133,000 coming from Ukraine, or 7.9%, 195,000, or 11.55%, coming from Spain, nearly 500,000, or 29% coming from Germany, and 768,000, or 5.45% coming from Turkey. Moving on to Armenia, 891,000 would be coming back, with 35,000, or 4%, coming from Belgium, 95,000, or 10.71%, coming from Syria, and 138,000, or 15.49%, coming from Argentina. However, the largest Armenian diaspora that I could find came from France, with 615,000, or 69%, originating from there. The next country is Albania, with 4,683,000, of which 58,000, or 1.21%, coming from Belgium, 275,000, or 5.67%, coming from Switzerland, 426,000, or 8.78%, coming from Greece, and 825,000 coming from Italy, or 16.98%. However, the vast majority of diaspora Albanians, or 3,244,000, would come from Turkey, making up 66.71% of the Albanian diaspora. Another Balkan nation, Bosnia and Herzegovina, is up next, with a diaspora of just over 800,000, of which 16,000 or 2% would come from North Macedonia, and the same amount would come from Norway. 25,000 or 3.14% would come from Kosovo, 33,000 or 4.21% would come from Slovenia, 63,000 or 7.83% would come from Sweden, 85,000 or 10.56% would come from Turkey, and 153,000 or 19% would come from Austria. However, 413,000 or just over half would be from coming back from Germany. Now moving on to Bosnia's best friend, we get Serbia. Just kidding, which has a diaspora of 1,271,000, of which 42,000 or 3.34% would come from Slovenia, 101,000 or 7.96% would come from Australia, 123,000 or 9.72% would come from Croatia, and 170,000 or 13.43% would come from Turkey. However, as opposed to Bosnia, there are many more Serbs in Austria instead of Germany, which has 330,000 or 26%, while Austria has just under 500,000 or 39%. Next country we have is Thailand, with 244,000 people, of which 10,000 would come from Iceland, or 4%, 22,000 would come from Norway, or 9%, 42,000 or 17.24% would come from Sweden, 71,000 or 29.32% would come from Taiwan, and 98,000 or 40.43% would come from Australia. The next country is Lithuania, whose diaspora consists of 520,000 people, with 31,000 or 6% from Ireland, and 50,000 or 9.5% coming from Norway. However, the vast majority would come from South America, with Brazil contributing 205,000 or 39.43%, and 230,000 or 44.21% coming from Argentina. Next is Croatia, with a diaspora of 1,761,000, with 55,000 or 3.15% coming from New Zealand, 172,000 or 9.79% coming from Australia, 230,000 or 13.07% coming from Argentina, 315,000 or 17.94% coming from Austria, 490,000 or 27.87% coming from Chile, and 496,000 or 28.18% coming from Germany. After this, we have Nepal, with a diaspora of 1,274,000, of which 144,000 or 11.38% come from Australia, 207,000 or 16.27% come from Malaysia, 225,000 or 17.67% come from Saudi Arabia, 294,000 or 23.09% come from the UAE, and 349,000 or 27.42% come from Qatar, meaning that Nepal is one of the few countries whose diaspora is not primarily located in one or two countries. Up next, there is Bangladesh, with a diaspora of 4,584,000, of which 294,000 or 6.43% come from Italy, 349,000 or 7.62% come from Qatar, 655,000 or 14.3% come from the UK, 1,065,000 or 23.25% come from the UAE, and finally 2,123,000 or 46.32% come from Saudi Arabia. Next, we have Egypt, with a diaspora of 3,271,000, of which 262,000 or 8% come from Qatar, 392,000 or 12% come from the UAE, 486,000 or 14.87% come from Kuwait, 631,000 or 19.3% come from Jordan, and 45.25% come from Saudi Arabia, meaning that the percentage of the Bangladeshi and Egyptian diaspora in that country is almost identical. After this, there is Somalia, with a diaspora of 1,516,000, the overwhelming majority of which is located in Yemen, with 1,274,000 or 84.05% being located there, but with significant minorities of 73,000 or 4.87% in Sweden, and 67,000 or 4.47% in the UAE. The Sri Lankan diaspora, though, is interesting for how varied it is, with a total of around 539,000, of which 16,000 or 3.09% are in Norway, 17,000 or 3.2% are in New Zealand, 53,000 or 9.9% are in Switzerland, 72,000 or 13.38% are in Kuwait, 96% or 17.89% are in Saudi Arabia, 122,000 or 22.8% are in Qatar, and 153,000 or 28.4% which are in Saudi Arabia. Next there is Iran, which has a diaspora of 1,407,000, of which 22,000 come from Norway, 27,000 or 2% come from Qatar, 31,000 or 2.23% come from Kuwait, 84,000 or 6% come from Sweden. However, the vast majority of Iranians are in 3 countries, with 287,000 or 20.4% coming from Canada, 441,000 or 31.4% coming from the UAE, and 512,000 or 36.41% coming from Turkey. Next, there is Vietnam, which has a diaspora of 3,624,000, of which 76,000 or 2.11% come from the Czech Republic, 262,000 or 7.25% come from Taiwan, 287,000 or 7.92% come from Canada, 352,000 or 9.74% come from Australia, and 41,000 or 11.32% come from France. But the vast majority, or 2,210,000 or 61%, come from the United States. This is similar to Greece, which has a diaspora of 98,000, of which 2.69% come from Chile, 131,000 or 3.6% come from Canada, 413,000 or 11.33% come from Germany, and 448,000 or 12.29% come from Australia. But again, the overwhelming majority, or 2,511,000 or 68.83%, would come from the United States. Now we get to this super uncontroversial topic of Palestine, which has a diaspora of 3,564,000, of which 105,000 or 2.96% come from Colombia, 145,000 or 4.09% come from the UAE, 450,000 or 12.63% come from Lebanon, and 596,000 or 16.74% come from Syria. But the vast majority of the Palestinian diaspora, 2,170,000 or 60.89%, come from Jordan. Next, we have the only slightly less controversial country of Afghanistan, with a diaspora of 3,751,000, of which 145,000 or 3.88% come from the UAE, 170,000 or 4.55% come from Turkey, and 330,000 or 8.82% come from Germany. However, the overwhelming majority, nearly 3 million people or 79%, come from Iran, with Romania's diaspora of 3,569,000, 100,000 or 2.8% come from Ukraine, and 118,000 or 3.3% come from Canada. But the vast majority are in 3 countries, nearly equally split between Italy with 1,061,000 or 29.73%, Spain with 1,073,000 or 30.04%, and Germany with 1,075,000 or 30.12%. Indonesia has a diaspora of 2,985,000, of which 82,000 or 2.77% come from the UAE, 86,000 or 2.9% come from Suriname, 93,000 or 3.12% come from Australia, 248,000 or 8.35% come from the Netherlands, 286,000 or 9.6% come from Taiwan, and 656,000 or 22% come from Malaysia. However, 1.5 million, or half of the Indonesian diaspora, actually comes from Saudi Arabia. Moving north, we reach South Korea, with a diaspora of 2,843,000, of which 109,000 or 3.85% come from Australia, 120,000 or 4.24% come from Kazakhstan, and 495,000 or 17.44% come from Japan. But as is often the case, just over 2 million or 70.68% come from the United States. Similar to this is the Japanese diaspora of 2,734,000, of which 73,000 or 2.7% come from Australia, 92,000 or 3.37% come from Argentina, and 114,000 or 4.18% come from the Philippines. However, the majority of the Japanese overseas community is located on the juggernauts of each America, with 821,000 or 30% from Brazil, and 1,574,000 or 57.57% from the United States. Pakistan has a diaspora of just over 5 million people spread around the world, with 263,000 or 5.24% from Thailand, and 332,000 or 6.59% from Canada. But the largest countries of origin would be the United Arab Emirates with 1,177,000 or 23.37%. the UK with 1,662,000 or 33%, and Saudi Arabia with 1.8 million or 35.75%. Iraq has one of the most spread out diasporas in the world, with a total of 1.7 million, of which 28,000 or 1.64% are from Finland, 29,000 or 1.74% are from Denmark, 33,000 or 1.95% from Norway, 50,000 or 2.94% are from the UAE, 54,000 or 3.19% are from the Netherlands, 85,000 or 5% are from Turkey, 100,000 or 5.9% are from Lebanon, 126,000 or 7.41% are from Jordan, 147,000 or 8.66% are from Sweden, and 330,000 or 19.41% are from Germany. But with 718,000 or 42.15% next door, Iran would be the clear winner. So finally, with the countries with the smaller diasporas out of the way, it's time to just get to the countries with the largest diasporas in the world, starting with Lebanon, with just over 5 million people in diaspora, of which 78,000 or 1.57% come from Kuwait, 96,000 or 1.93% come from the UAE, 193,000 or 3.85% come from Saudi Arabia, 254,000 or 5.07% come from Canada, 262,000 or 5.24% come from Australia, 341,000 or 6.82% come from France, 463,000 or 9.25% come from the Ivory Coast, 142,000 or 28.4% come from Colombia, and 1,749,000 or 34.92% come from Argentina. Next, we have Turkey with 6,582,000 in diaspora, which is spread over a massive amount of countries. 376,000 or 5.72% come from Belgium, 381,000 or 5.8% come from Cyprus, 433,000 or 6.58% come from Austria, 433,000 or 6.73% come from the Netherlands, 536,000 or 8.15% come from Bulgaria, and 1,093,000 or 16.62% come from France. However, as we well know, the largest number of Turks in diaspora are in Germany, with 2,812,000 or 42.73% being located there. Then we have the Netherlands, whose diaspora size depends on what metric we use. If we strictly mean the diaspora from that country, it is 5 million, with 322,000 or 6.45% from Argentina, 404,000 or 8.1% from Australia, and 758,000 or 15.17% from Canada. However, the vast majority of the diaspora, with 3,144,000 or 62.29%, come from the US. Nevertheless, if we also include Afrikaners as Dutch people, then the stats change a lot, with a total Dutch diaspora of 8,948,000, of which now 3.6% come from Argentina, 4.52% come from Australia, 8.48% come from Canada, and 34.81% come from the United States. The largest country of origin would be South Africa, from where 92.57% of Afrikaners come from, amounting to a total of 3,654,000 or 40.84%. Now we get to perhaps the most controversial diaspora here, the Jewish diaspora. While many will say that Jews do not come from Israel, historical and genetic evidence points to pretty much all of them having significant Levantine origin, although to different degrees. So with that explained, let's look at where the Jewish diaspora would be coming from. There would be 9,845,000 coming back, with 105,000 or 1.07% from Colombia, 136,000 or 1.39% from Australia, 176,000 or 1.79% from Chile, 184,000 or 1.87% from Argentina, 277,000 or 2.81% from the UK, 367,000 or 3.73% from Ukraine, 447,000 or 4.54% from Canada, and 546,000 or 5.56% from France. However, by far the majority would be hailing from the United States, with 7,401,000 or 3/4 of diaspora Jews from there. Their neighbor Syria would receive 10,412,000 from the diaspora, with 450,000 or 4.33% from Saudi Arabia, 948,000 or 9.11% from Colombia, 1.1 million or 10.58% from Lebanon, 1,240,000 or 11.92% from Germany, 1,335,000 or 12.82% from Argentina, and 1.4 million or 13.46% from Jordan. But a third or 3.5 million would come from Turkey. Another country with a large diaspora is the Philippines, which is 10,085,000, with 201,000 of those or 2% from Singapore, 206,000 or 2.05% from Qatar, 371,000 or 3.69% from Japan, 432,000 or 4.29% from Australia, 449,000 or 4.46% from Malaysia, 516,000 or 5.12% from the UAE, 740,000 or 7.34% from Saudi Arabia, and 1,058,000 or 10.5% from Canada. Finally, 4,253,000 or 42.17% would come from the United States. Now, the next country is very fascinating because its diaspora statistics have rapidly changed since a mere couple of years ago. And that country is Ukraine, with a diaspora of 11,327,000. Out of this total number, 353,000 or 3.12% are from Italy, 381,000 or 3.36% are from Kazakhstan, 616,000 or 5.44% are from Brazil, 874,000 or 7.72% are from Argentina, 930,000 or 8.22% are from Canada, 1,038,000 or 9.17% are from the US, and 1,158,000 or 10.22% are from Germany. However, half, or 5,591,000, are from Poland, almost all of which is recent. Next, we get to the country that caused such a large diaspora from Ukraine, which is Russia, with a diaspora of 16,438,000. However, we will look at the diaspora of different ethnicities within the country, starting with the Chechen diaspora of 148,000, of which 22,000 or 15.48% come from Jordan, 40,000 or 27% from Kazakhstan, and 85,000 or 57.53% from Turkey. Next, there's the Circassian diaspora with 2,685,000, of which 71,000 or 2.67% come from Syria, 137,000 or 5.13% come from Jordan, and 2,470,000 or 92.2% which come from Turkey. And for the actual ethnic Russian diaspora of 13,605,000, 256,000 or 1.88% comes from Turkey, 276,000 or 2.03% comes from Argentina, 282,000 or 2.08% are from Turkmenistan, 293,000 or 2.16% come from Kyrgyzstan, 295,000 or 2.17% come from Estonia, 341,000 or 2.51% come from France, 426,000 or 3.14% come from Canada, 445,000 or 3.28% come from Latvia, 705,000 or 5.19% come from Uzbekistan, and 1,323,000 or 9.73% come from Germany. Awkwardly, though, the second largest country of origin is the US with 2,748,000 or 18.22%, and more awkwardly, number one is Ukraine with 5,772,000 or 42.06%. After Russia, we have one of its sworn enemies, Poland, which has a diaspora of 19,538,000, which 758,000 or 3.88% come from Canada, 1,095,000 or 5.61% come from France, 1,749,000 or 8.96% come from Argentina, 2,150,000 or 11% come from Germany, and 3,902,000 or 22% come from Brazil. However, as usual, the U.S. is dominating with 8,875,000 or 45.43% of the Polish diaspora. Next, there's the tiny country of Ireland, which has a massive population of 21,920,000, of which 604,000 or 2.76% come from New Zealand, 644,000 or 2.94% come from Argentina, 1,591,000 or 7.26% come from Canada, and 3,966,000 or 18.1% come from Australia. Once again, though, the U.S. dominates with 14,970,000 people, or 68.29% of the Irish diaspora. After this, we get another country that starts with I, the population superpower of India, with a diaspora of 26,281,000, which is one of the most globally spread populations around the world, with 6.9% from Africa, 8.8% from Europe, 21.8% from the Indo-Pacific, 23.5% from West Asia, and 29.2% from North America. Now, as you can see from this chart, there are so many countries with a large Indian diaspora, but we'll do all countries which form at least 1% of that number, starting with Fiji with 348,000 or 1.33%, followed by Guyana with 410,000 or 1.56%, then Thailand with 461,000 or 1.76%, then Singapore with 532,000 or 2.03%, Trinidad and Tobago with 588,000 or 2.24%, Qatar with 609,000 or 2.32%, Kuwait with 746,000 or 2.84%, Australia with 826,000 or 3.14%, Mauritius with 831,000 or 3.16%, Sri Lanka with 925,000 or 3.52%, Philippines with 1,027,000 or 3.91%, South Africa with 1.7 million or 6.47%, Saudi Arabia with 1.9 million or 7.22%, the UK with 1,926,000 or 7.33%, Canada with 2,058,000 or 7.83%, Malaysia with 2,281,000 or 8.68%, and then the UAE with 2,551,000 or 9.71%. However, as number one, we have the United States with 5 million people or 19.11%. Now, next we have France with a diaspora of nearly 30 million people, of which 804,000 or 2.72% come from Chile, and 1,026,000 or 3.47% come from Brazil. However, the vast majority of the French diaspora is located in 3 American countries, with 7 million or 23.64% coming from Argentina, 9,369,000 or 31.65% coming from Canada, and 10,382,000 or 35% from the United States. After France, we get to its historical rival Germany, with a much larger diaspora of 62,796,000. Of which 1 million or 1.59% come from Chile, 1,083,000 or 1.73% come from Australia, 1,749,000 or 2.79% come from Argentina, 2.4 million or 3.82% come from Canada, and 9 million or 14.39% come from Brazil. However, as usual, the huge majority consisting of 45,447,000 or 72.37% come from the US. Now, with a slightly larger diaspora, China comes in next, with a diaspora of 64,760,000, which, like India, is spread across the entire globe. So once again, we'll look at every country which makes up at least 1% of the Chinese diaspora, starting with Japan with 991,000 or 1.53%, Australia with 1,469,000 or 2.27%, Canada with 1.9 million or 2.93%, Philippines with 2,568,000 or 3.97%, Indonesia with 3,368,000 or 5.2%, Singapore with 4.5 million or 6.95%, the United States with 5,291,000 or 8.17%, Malaysia with 7,880,000 or 12.17%, and Thailand with 9,068,000 or 14%. However, Taiwan would be the largest source of the diaspora with 22,460,000 or 34.68%. Now, after this, we have Portugal, which is interesting because depending on what standard we're using, has a wide range of numbers for the size of its diaspora. Now, if we only consider those of full Portuguese descent, then the diaspora is 17,365,000. Of which 328,000 or 1.89% come from Canada, 559,000 or 3.22% come from Angola, 1,220,000 or 7% come from Brazil, 1,406,000 or 8.1% come from the US, and 2,534,000 or 14.6% come from France. But as you can expect, the vast majority, with 11,090,000 or 63.87%, come from Brazil. However, if we include half of the mixed population of Portuguese of descent, then the diaspora goes up by nearly 71 million, leading to a total amount of 88,832,000, of which Venezuela makes up 1.38%, the US 1.59%, France makes up 2.87%. However, now Brazil's number would jump to 80,866,000, comprising 91.55% of the Portuguese diaspora. Next, there's Italy with a diaspora of 91,771,000. And we will once again look at all the countries which form at least 1% of that number. Starting with Canada, whose 1,090,000 people make up 1.19% of the diaspora. Then there is Australia with 1,170,000 or 1.28%, Paraguay with 1,181,000 or 1.29%, Uruguay with 1.5 million or 1.64%, Colombia with 1,790,000 or 1.95%, Venezuela with 4,669,000 or 5.09%, and France with 5,894,000 or 6.42%. However, the largest diasporas are in the US with 17,951,000 or 19.56%. Argentina with 21,871,000 or 23.83%, and Brazil with 30.8 million or 33.57%. Next, there's the UK, which has a diaspora of 114,684,000, but I will break down this by the different countries of the UK. We'll start with Wales, which has a rather small diaspora of 2.6 million, of which 46,000 or 1.77% come from Argentina, 254,000 or 9.77% come from Australia, and 328,000 or 12.6% come from Canada. But the vast majority is located in the US, with 1,975,000 or 75.87% coming from there. Now, this is almost identical to Scotland, which has a much larger diaspora of nearly 40 million, of which 1,134,000 or 2.84% come from Argentina, 3,584,000 or 9% come from Australia, and 4.9 million or 12.28% come from Canada. As with Wales, 75% or 30 million of the Scottish diaspora comes from the US. And finally, we get to England, with a diaspora of 70,921,000, of which 1,542,000 or 2.17% come from New Zealand, 1,811,000 or 2.56% come from South Africa, 4,544,000 or 6.41% come from Canada, and 13,795,000 or 19.45% come from Australia. But again, the US still wins, with 47 million or 2/3 of the English diaspora coming from there. So altogether in the UK, 1,811,000 or 1.58% of the diaspora comes from South Africa, 2,676,000 or 2.33% come from New Zealand, 9,773,000 or 8.52% come from Canada, and 18.9 million or 16.48% come from Australia. But the US definitely wins, with 79 million people or 68.92% of the British diaspora. And finally, we get to the juggernaut here, which is Spain. No matter what metric we use, it has a massive diaspora. If we only looked at the unmixed population, again excluding Mexico, Spain has a diaspora of 87 million people, of which 1,081,000 or 1.24% come from Nicaragua, 1,477,000 or 1.7% come from Peru, 2,035,000 or 2.34% come from the Dominican Republic, 3,525,000 or 4.05% come from Costa Rica, 3,542,000 or 4.07% come from Guatemala, 6,345,000 or 7.29% come from Cuba, 6.5 million or 7.47% come from Venezuela, 10,855,000 or 12.47% come from Colombia, and 16,430,000 or 18.87% come from Brazil. But weirdly, even here, the US would win, with 31,850,000 or 36.6%. But if we also include half of the mixed Spanish diaspora, the number goes up by 80 million to a total of 166,741,000, of which 1,761,000 or 1% come from Panama, 2,276,000 or 1.31% come from Paraguay, 2,624,000 or 1.5% come from Argentina, 3,275,000 or 1.88% come from Nicaragua, 3,320,000 or 1.9% come from Bolivia, 3,427,000 or 2% come from El Salvador, 4,181,000 or 2.4% come from Costa Rica, 4,364,000 or 2.5% come from Honduras, 5,340,000 or 3.06% come from Guatemala, 5,962,000 or 3.42% come from the Dominican Republic. 7,682,000 or 4.41% come from Cuba. 7,753,000 or 4.45% come from Ecuador. 12,366,000 or 7.1% come from Peru. 13,824,000 or 7.93% come from Venezuela. 16,430,000 or 9.43% come from Brazil. And 23,634,000 or 13.56% come from Colombia. But the winner is still the US with 31,850,000 or 26.7% of the Spanish diaspora. With that out of the way, let's now look at which country's population would grow the most per capita, starting with a scenario where only people of full or near full descent come back. We'll only look at countries whose population would go up by at least 10%, starting with Russia. Russia has a population of 146.2 million, but with an influx of 16.4 million that would go up to 162.6 million, making it an increase of 11.25%. Tunisia has a population of 11.7 million, with an influx of 1.4 million. That would go up to 13.1 million, making an increase of 11.68%. Ukraine currently has a population of 33.4 million. It would lose 6.7 million but would gain 11.3 million, causing the population to reach 38 million, an increase of 13.95%. Georgia currently has a population of 3.7 million. It would lose 103,000 but gain 714,000, causing the population to reach 4.2 million, making that an increase of 16.56%. The Netherlands currently has a population of 18.2 million. It would lose 4.5 million but would gain 7.5 million, including Afrikaners, causing the population to reach 21.2 million, making that an increase of 16.64%. Hungary currently has a population of 9.6 million, but with an influx of 1.7 million that would go up to 11.3 million, making it an increase of 17.77%. Bulgaria currently has a population of 6.4 million. It would lose 536,000, but would gain 1.7 million, causing the population to reach 7.5 million, making that an increase of 18.07%. Romania currently has a population of 19.1 million, but with an influx of 3.6 million that would go up to 22.6 million, making that an increase of 18.72%. Bosnia and Herzegovina currently has a population of 3.4 million, but with an influx of 808,000 that would go up to 4.2 million, making it an increase of 23.54%. Azerbaijan currently has a population of 10.3 million. It would lose 176,000 but would gain 2.9 million, causing the population to reach 13 million, making that an increase of 25.96%. Malta currently has a population of 542,000. It would lose 59,000 but would gain 201,000, causing the population to reach 684,000, making that an increase of 26.3%. Greece currently has a population of 10.4 million. It will lose 739,000 but would gain 3.6 million, causing the population to reach 13.3 million, making that an increase of 27.95%. Armenia currently has a population of 3 million. It will lose 24,000 but would gain 891,000, causing the population to reach 3.9 million, an increase of 28.77%. Croatia currently has a population of 3.9 million. It would lose 324,000 but would gain 1.8 million, causing the population to reach 5.3 million, making that an increase of 37.2%. Syria currently has a population of 23.9 million. It would lose 763,000 but would gain 10.4 million, causing the population to reach 33.5 million, making that an increase of 40.43%. Germany currently has a population of 82.7 million. It will lose 23.7 million but would gain 62.8 million, causing the population to reach 121.8%, making that an increase of 47.22%. Poland currently has a population of 38 million. It would lose 456,000 but would gain 19.5 million, causing the population to reach 57.1 million, making that an increase of 50.17%. Norway currently has a population of 5.6 million. It would lose 1 million but would gain 4.3 million, causing the population to reach 8.8 million, making that an increase of 58.73%. Lebanon currently has a population of 5.3 million. It would lose 1.7 million but would gain 5 million, causing the population to reach 8.7 million, making that an increase of 63.4%. Palestine currently has a population of 5.5 million, but with an influx of 3.6 million that would go up to 9 million, making that an increase of 65%. Tonga currently has a population of 100,000. It would lose 3,000 but would gain 89,000, causing the population to reach 186,000, making that an increase of 85.8%. Samoa currently has a population of 205,000. It would lose 8,000 but would gain 197,000, causing the population to reach 394,000, making that an increase of 92.14%. Israel currently has a population of 9.9 million, but with an influx of 9.8 million, that would go up to 19.7 million, making that an increase of 99.45%. Now we get to the UK, which currently has a population of 67.6 million. It will lose 16.2 million but would gain 114.5 million, causing the population to reach 165.8 million, making that an increase of 145.35%. Now broken down by country, Wales currently has a population of 3.1 million. It will lose 284,000 but would gain 2.6 million, causing the population to reach 5.5 million, and that would be an increase of 74.07%. England currently has a population of 56.5 million. It will lose 15.1 million but would gain 70.7 million, causing the population to reach 112.1 million, making that an increase of 98.31%. Cornwall currently has a population of 578,000. It will lose 18,000 but would gain 1.3 million, causing the population to reach 1.8 million, making that an increase of 215.65%. Scotland currently has a population of 5.4 million. It would lose 701,000 but would gain 39.9 million, causing the population to reach 44.6 million, making that an increase of 720.49%. Italy currently has a population of 59 million. It would lose 5.3 million but would gain 91.8 million, causing the population to reach 145.4 million, making that an increase of 146.63%. Portugal currently has a population of 10.6 million. It would lose 797,000 but would gain 17.4 million, causing the population to reach 27.2 million, making that an increase of 155.71%. Spain currently has a population of 48.8 million. It would lose 6.6 million but would gain 92 million, causing the population to reach 134.2 million, making that an increase of 175.11%. Albania currently has a population of 2.4 million, but with an influx of 4.8 million, that would go up to 7.3 million, making that an increase of 202.45%. Ireland currently has a population of 5.3 million. It will lose 1.2 million, but would gain 21.9 million, causing the population to reach 26 million, making that an increase of 391.64%. Now, luckily, because most of these countries don't have a large mixed population, instead of rereading this list for each country, we'll just look at the countries whose numbers have changed, and thus whose populations would increase by a higher number. First on the list is the Netherlands, which including half of the mixed population, mostly Cape-colored and Indo people, would reach a population of 24.4 million, a gain of 3.2 million compared to last time, and a gain of 10.7 million overall, leading to an increase of 34.02% compared to the current population of 18.2 million. This will place the Netherlands between Croatia and Armenia. Then there is Spain, which including half of the mixed population, pretty much all in Latin America, would reach a population of 216.5 million, again excluding Mexico, a gain of 82.2 million compared to last time, and a gain of 174.3 million overall, leading to an increase of 246.65% compared to the current population of 48.8 million. This would put Spain above Albania, but it would still remain at third place. This is because Ireland would be downgraded to second place, while good old Portugal would reach first place, which including just half of its mixed descent population, would reach a population of 98.2 million. This is a gain of 71 million compared to last time, and a gain of 88.3 million overall, leading to an increase of 822.71% compared to the current population of 10.6 million. And finally, we get to the partial diaspora, and we see things change a lot. With now the entire mixed population from the Netherlands, it would reach a population of 27.5 million, a gain of 3.2 million compared to last time, and a gain of 13.9 million overall, leading to an increase of 51.4% compared to the population of 18.2 million. This would place the Netherlands between Norway and Poland. Then there is Spain, which including all of the mixed population of Spanish descent, would reach a population of 298.7 million, again excluding Mexico, a gain of 18.2 million compared to last time, and a gain of 256.5 million overall, leading to an increase of 512.18% compared to the current population of 48.8 million. This would now put Spain above Ireland to reach second place. However, our winner is definitely Portugal, which including all of its mixed descent population, mostly in Brazil, would reach a population of 169.1 million. This is a gain of 71 million compared to last time and a gain of 159.3 million overall, leading to an increase of 1,489.71% compared to the current population of 10.6 million, which is nearly 16 times more. And that is it, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. Now, I know this was extremely heavily statistic based. I don't expect this to be my most popular or interesting video, but I have included a bunch of timestamps so you can choose the country that you are interested in, and you can look at, for example, how much that population would grow, where those immigrants would come from, etc., etc. And so that way you don't have to listen through all of this. Anyways, this video certainly shows how much impact migration has had in our world and just how over or underpopulated certain parts of the world would be. Of course, don't forget to like and share. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to watch my history video on what if colonialism never happened. And I will see you guys next time. Thank you.